Hello everybody, welcome back to Blue HQ, and I am here today to give the 5th video in my Rebreather series of videos. I would like to begin by reminding you, I am not an instructor. I'm really just a guy that likes to talk about stuff. So obviously nobody's going to sell you a Rebreather without taking the class anyway, but I just want to remind everybody that these videos are for informational purposes. I'm not necessarily going to tell you everything you need to know about a subject. These are videos that are just for people that are curious. Maybe you saw our Blue World episode where Todd and I got certified on the Sidewinder Rebreather and you're curious about rebreathers. Or maybe you're a diver and you're thinking about getting a rebreather, and these videos might help you just understand rebreathers a little bit better before you make the plunge. This is not a class. I am not an instructor, so I just want to throw that out there. In our 5th video today, I'm going to talk about the differences between mCCRs and eCCRs. You may recall that in my last video, I talked about the 2 major categories of rebreathers. You have the fully closed rebreather, or the closed circuit rebreather, CCR, and the semi-closed rebreather. And I talked for a long time about the differences between these 2 rebreathers. Today, I want to delve a little bit more into the technology of the CCR, the fully closed rebreather itself, because there are 2 sort of design philosophies in building them. And it's kind of a small difference, but a sort of a fundamental different way of approaching how you blend the gas. Let me first just review what is a CCR, what is a fully closed rebreather as opposed to a semi-closed rebreather. A fully closed rebreather is a gas blender that you wear on your back that utilizes 2 gases. You have one tank containing pure oxygen, and you have another tank that is containing a diluent. Very often that diluent is air, which means it's mostly nitrogen. So your diluent is effectively nitrogen. And this means that when your rebreather blends these 2 gases, you get some flavor of nitrox. And the beauty of the fully closed rebreather is that by having independent control over the oxygen and the diluent being the gas that you use to dilute the oxygen, by blending these 2, you can blend them in whatever ratio is appropriate for the depth that you're at. So that you always have a blend that has the maximum safe amount of oxygen for whatever depth. Therefore, you have the absolute minimum nitrogen you can possibly have in order to have the longest dive with the least decompression. And it's as simple as that. The question is, with a fully closed rebreather, how does the blending happen? And that really comes down to, how does that rebreather handle the oxygen? So the thing to remember is that all of the fully closed rebreathers handle the diluent in the same way. So I'll go over that first. As you're descending, the pressure is squishing in on your body and squishing in on your rebreather, and it makes the volume of gas in your breathing loop go down because it gets squished. And so as you're descending, you have to put more gas into your rebreather. And usually that's with diluent, because you're just filling that volume. And there's 2 ways you can do it. You can do it manually, just squirt it in as you need it. And you can also do it with what they call an ADV, an automatic diluent valve. That's really nothing more than a SCUBA regulator. You know, in a SCUBA regulator, when you inhale, you cause a vacuum which pulls in on a diaphragm and pushes a lever and squirts air into your lungs. That's all a regulator is. I have a video on how regulators work if you're curious about that. There's the video. Check it out. It's kind of fun. An ADV is nothing but basically a regulator on your rebreather. When you inhale, if you suck all the air out of your counter lung so that you can't take a full breath, you form a vacuum, and that vacuum kicks in a little valve that squirts in some diluent. That's it. That's an ADV. It's just a regulator. There are different philosophies on whether you should use an ADV or not. The way I was trained is that you would use your ADV in a situation where maybe you're doing a very fast descent and your hands are full because you're filming, and you want to leave that task to your rebreather to just do it. But if you're doing a slower descent, maybe you don't have a camera, you've got attention span that you can worry about that. You can control your PO2 a lot better if you manually add your diluent, because as you're going down, you may decide to add some dill and then some oxygen, then some dill, and then some oxygen, and not just put in dill. And so if you do it manually, you have more control. That's completely based on your philosophy. Whichever way you like to do it is the way you like to do it. But the point is that the way you add dill is the same for manual CCRs or electronic CCRs. So there's no difference. So when we talk about the difference between an mCCR and an eCCR, we are talking entirely about how the oxygen is added to the loop. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. And to do that, we're going to the whiteboard. All right, so what we have here is my incredibly good artwork showing a closed circuit rebreather. And this would be the same for an eCCR or an mCCR. So basically, here's your mouthpiece. It's got one-way valves in it so that when you exhale into the mouthpiece, your breath is going to go this way. It's going to go into the counter lung, which I'm showing as a big wavy bag because it's usually actually like a plastic bag, like a really heavy-duty plastic bag. Then it goes around into the scrubber canister, which, as you know, is filled with the scrubber material, which chemically binds carbon dioxide. So it absorbs the carbon dioxide coming out of your lungs, out of your body, binds it into a chemical, and then the gas continues around, and then it goes through the other one-way valve and back into your lungs. So when you exhale, this counter lung inflates, and then when you inhale, you draw that breath back around through, and it just goes around in a big circle, which is why we call it closed circuit, a circle. You'll see the similarity in those words with a Latin root. So this is a closed circuit rebreather. And eCCR means it's an electronic rebreather, and mCCR means it is a manual rebreather. And like I said, the only difference between these two units is how the oxygen is added, right? So the eCCR is a more complicated design, but it's actually easier to explain. So I'm going to start by talking about the eCCR. So what is happening here is when you exhale, you've got carbon dioxide coming out, and you've also got a reduced amount of oxygen coming out of you as goes into you. So your breath going around into the counter lung has CO2 in it, and it has less oxygen than we would like. So it goes around and it comes over here and it goes through the scrubber, and the scrubber takes care of the CO2 part. But then we need to add some oxygen. So there's a little, now it's different in different rebreathers. Keep in mind, this doesn't represent any particular rebreather. It's a generic rebreather concept drawing. There's an oxygen sensor somewhere in that rebreather, and it is connected to a dive computer, which is on your wrist usually. And your dive computer is going to read that oxygen sensor. Now, sometimes, usually there's more than one, but in our simple rebreather diagram, there's one oxygen sensor. Your computer is reading the amount of oxygen in your mix, so it knows what is there. So what it's going to do in an eCCR, this computer is connected to this little box, okay? And this little box has a solenoid, and this solenoid is connected to your O2 bottle. And so the computer is going to read the PO2 of your breathing mix, and it's going to decide if your PO2 needs to be increased or not. So let's say that you've set your computer that you want a PO2 of 1.3. The computer is going to try to maintain that PO2. It's going to read what you've got. Let's say you've got 1.2. It's going to say, oh, we've got 1.2, but we need 1.3. So it's going to send a signal down to this solenoid, and the solenoid is an electronic valve, okay, that's operated by the computer. And all it does is it says to the solenoid, open for a second. And so the computer tells this valve to put some oxygen in there. So it goes, it puts some oxygen in there, and it waits a second to see what happens, and it makes another makes another measurement, and then it says, are we good, or do we need more? And if you're good, you're good. And if you need more, it'll go, oh, okay, let's do another squirt. Put a little more in. And then eventually, it will reach a steady state of 1.3, and your rebreather will be happily chugging along. That's it. That's an eCCR. That is how an eCCR works. You have oxygen sensor monitored by a computer. Computer has a set point. Computer maintains the set point by controlling the addition of the oxygen electronically. eCCR. Simple. Now, what's the advantage of that? Well, the advantage of that is when everything works correctly, you don't have to do anything, really. The computer makes your PO2 exactly what it should be, and you just go about filming sharks or cave diving or whatever it is that you're doing, you just do it. One of the primary rules that they do teach you, though, and it's a very important rule, just like we have rules in cave diving, you know, you got to have alternate air supply, you've got to have spare lights, you've got to always have a continuous guideline to the surface. There are very important rules of cave diving. There are very, very important rules of rebreather diving. And one of those rules, probably the most important rule, is always know what you're breathing. And what that means is always know your PO2. Always. You can never trust your computer to just do it. You have to always be watching it. Always be watching it. Because here's what can happen. This is what the detractors will say about eCCRs. You can have a failure of the solenoid. You can have a failure of the power supply that runs the solenoid, which is not the computer, it's a separate battery. You can have a failure of the computer. You can have a failure of the O2 sensor. You can have a failure of the wire between the O2 sensor and the computer. You can have a failure of the wire between the computer and the solenoid. You can run out of oxygen, and your computer is telling it to put in oxygen, but there's no oxygen to put in. There's a bunch of things that can go wrong. Now, 99% of the time, they don't go wrong. They work fine, just like 99% of the time you get in your car and you start it and you drive away. But every once in a while, your car has a problem. And it's a problem because the car doesn't go. The thing about a rebreather is that when a rebreather has a problem, you might not notice it and you can die. So you always have to be watching your PO2, whether you're on an eCCR or an mCCR. To address this potential issue, the idea of the mCCR might make sense as well. So let's talk about that one before we come back to this one. So in an mCCR, this does not exist. And in fact, there is no solenoid at all. There is, in fact, another kind of device that's a little constant flow orifice, and I don't know how to draw that well, so it's a circle with a dot in it, because I'm a super artist. And what happens with the mCCR, you still have oxygen sensors, you still have a dive computer, because you need a dive computer to calculate your decompression time and all that stuff. So you still have all this stuff, and all that stuff can still go wrong. But here's what you don't have. You don't have the computer in control of your O2. You might say, oh, so you just add the O2 manually. Well, you can do it that way. You could just watch your PO2 on your computer, and when you need some O2, hit a button, add a little bit. Watch it, go, maybe a little more. Okay, that's good. The problem is that if you do it that way, you're going to have to do it like every 1 to 2 minutes because your body's metabolizing that oxygen and that PO2 is always going to be going down. And so you're just going to be constantly having to watch it and do it. If you have nothing else to do on the dive, that might be okay. But if you've got a camera or you're trying to do literally anything, it's going to be a super pain to be constantly having to do that. And if you forget to do it, your PO2 is going to go down, 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 down. And obviously, I don't need to tell you why that's bad. So what a manual CCR does is adds a tiny little orifice which has the oxygen just trickling in all the time. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, isn't that an SCR? Isn't that what SCRs do? No. SCRs only use one gas. They have a nitrox bottle and they have an orifice, but the orifice flows at like 5 to 8 liters per minute because most of what's going through that orifice is actually nitrogen, not oxygen. Okay, so you need to put a lot of gas through that unit to keep your oxygen level up. In this particular case, that orifice is only flowing pure oxygen. So you only have to put through like 1 liter per minute, a tiny trickle. When you're underwater, you can barely even hear the thing. It's so little because your body doesn't actually metabolize that much oxygen. So with a manual CCR, you don't rely on the computer to do anything. And what people say as the advantages are, if all of this electronics fails, there's still oxygen going in. You don't exactly know what you're breathing, so you want to get out of the water pretty quickly if that were to happen. But you're not going to just not have oxygen. You are always going to have life-sustaining oxygen coming into the unit as long as you have O2 in the tank and the valve is open, which is kind of a key important thing. So the thing is, different people use different amounts of oxygen. So how do you set this little orifice so that it flows the right amount of oxygen? And the answer is that on the O2 tank, there's a regulator, and that regulator can be set to a certain pressure. When you set it to the right pressure, the flow of oxygen through that orifice will be right for you. And if it's too much, you can set that pressure of the regulator lower, and it'll reduce the flow. And if it's not enough, you can increase it a little bit. And for a perfect example, when Todd and I first got our sidewinders, which are manual CCRs, he was having trouble with his oxygen not maintaining well, whereas mine was like pretty much perfect right out of the box. And so we had to take his regulator, and all you do is adjust the intermediate pressure, bring it up 5 psi, and then you get a little bit more flow, and then his unit was acting with his body more like my unit was acting with mine. So you can adjust that. And once you get it dialed in, what you want to do with a manual CCR is you want to have it provide you a good amount of oxygen to maintain a constant PO2 at rest so that it doesn't give you too much when you're resting. And when you start working hard, if you're swimming really hard, you're going to find that over time your PO2 is going to slowly go down a little bit because you're actually using a little tiny bit more oxygen than you were when you were resting. And so that's when you go, you put a little manual add. So in mCCR, what you have is more reliability, but it requires a little bit more paying attention. Okay, but because there is a constant flow of oxygen, it actually takes a pretty long time for your PO2 to get out of whack. So, like I said, the golden rule with rebreathers, always know what you're breathing, always know your PO2. It does not matter whether you're diving an eCCR or an mCCR, if you're not always keeping an eye on your PO2, at least every couple of minutes, you're doing it wrong. And that's how you can get in trouble. So with either unit, you really can't just ignore your PO2. So you can't use the argument that one is better than the other one because of how much attention you have to give it. They both need attention. So let's look at some advantages and some disadvantages. Of course, the advantage of an mCCR is simplicity. They're simpler, which makes them, many people would say, more reliable because there's just less stuff that can break. So one of the advantages of an eCCR is that they hold their set point really well. You have a computer controlling that, and the computer's entire job is to do that, and it's just doing that. Every second, it's just watching that PO2 and it's holding it really, really solid. So one of the advantages of the eCCR is the fact that it can hold your set point so well. But that can also be a disadvantage at times. Let me throw a hypothetical situation at you. You're swimming along, and you're on a reef, and now, I gotta go up and over the reef and back down the other side. So you're swimming along, your eCCR is holding your PO2 at 1.3, everything's good. When you get to the reef and you pop up like 20 feet, your PO2 is gonna drop because the pressure dropped. And the computer's gonna go, oh no, the PO2 dropped. And it's gonna put a bunch of O2 into your loop, which is gonna hit you without warning. It's just going to happen. All of a sudden, you're going to have a buoyancy change that just happens on top of the one that you did by swimming up. You're going to be like, whoa. And then when you go back down the other side, now you have way more oxygen in the unit, and your PO2, which was now adjusted at the top of the reef to be 1.3, when you drop back down the other side of the reef, it's going to go up to 1.4. I'm just making the number up. It's going to go really high, and now you're way past your set point. And keep in mind, there's no way for the eCCR to remove oxygen. It's in the loop. It's blended with the nitrogen. There's nothing you can do. So you can either just leave it at 1.4 and breathe, and it'll breathe down, and the computer won't do anything. It'll just wait for it to breathe down below 1.3, and then it'll start adding again. Or the other thing you can do is you can say, because remember, you're always watching that PO2. You're going to go, it went up to 1.4. That's not good. So you might burp a little gas out through your nose and manually add a little diluent, which is going to dilute, it's diluent, it's going to dilute the oxygen, brings it back down. So if you were on an mCCR in that same situation, you're coming to the reef, you know this is going to happen. I'm going to pop up, my PO2 is going to go down, but I'm going to go right back down the other side, and it's going to go right back to where it is. And you can basically do that, whoop, whoop, nothing happens. Your buoyancy doesn't get wonky. You don't have to compensate for too much O2 when you go back down the other side and put some. So there are cases in which, because an eCCR doesn't exactly know what's happening on your dive, and it just knows it has to maintain a set point, there are times when an mCCR, because you're driving it basically, you anticipate what's happening on the dive and stay in control and get ahead of things like that. With an mCCR, you don't have as solid of a set point because it's not being done by a computer. It's being done manually with the help of a trickle valve, if you will. So you will look down and you're expecting to see a PO2 of 1.3 and it's 1.25. And so you might go, okay, put a little in there. Or you might look down and it's 1.35 and you're like, oh, okay, there's a little bit too much, and you may decide to do something or not do something depending on the situation. So whereas an eCCR holds its set point really well, most of the time that's an advantage. An mCCR, it fluctuates a little bit more. So what you may find is that with an eCCR, even though you can waste some gas with depth changes and it's sort of overcompensating to maintain, you may have a little bit less deco time just because it maintains that set point more precisely. Not necessarily always, but you may. So that is one thing to talk about between an mCCR and the eCCR. The flip side, if you have a failure of the electronics in an eCCR, I mean, a failure of the solenoid, so that it's not able to add gas by itself and you have to control it manually, it's a lot more of a load on your brain to run it manually than an mCCR, which is designed for that from the start. Because if this is completely not working down here, and you automatically, and you have to actually add the O2 manually, you're going to have to do an add like every 60 seconds. You're going to have to watch it like a hawk. So in an eCCR, when something breaks, you're going to manage that. You're going to abort the dive. So these days, are these kind of failures common? Not really. These designs are pretty mature at this point. But it is worth mentioning, both units can be controlled manually, but an mCCR, which is designed to be controlled manually, is much easier to do that. When I called Todd to ask about making this video, if he had any other things I should add to this, I said, what do you think the differences are between mCCRs and eCCRs? He said, about $5,000. And it is worth pointing out that mCCRs can be quite a bit less expensive because there's less moving parts. I think that over time, the cost of eCCRs has come down a little bit, and so the difference isn't as much as it used to be. And you should probably never base a decision like this on cost. You should base a decision like this on what's the unit that's right for the kind of diving you're doing. So let me talk about one disadvantage of an mCCR. Remember I talked about that regulator. The regulator's IP has to be set around somewhere between 135 and 160, depending on your body, to flow the right amount of O2. When you get to about 300 feet deep, which is very deep, by the way, when you get to about 300 feet deep, that's the pressure of the ambient water, which means that now the pressure on one side of this orifice is the same as the pressure on the other side, and the orifice doesn't flow. So an mCCR basically stops working at 300 feet. Now, there's workarounds like there are with everything. There are ways to use a different kind of regulator that's depth compensated and then use a variable orifice in order to overcome that. So there are ways to use mCCRs deeper than that. But out of the box, your basic mCCR has about a 300-foot depth limit. An eCCR does not have that problem. An eCCR doesn't really care what depth it's at, as long as you have the appropriate diluent. Obviously, if you're at 300 feet, you can't use air as a diluent. You're going to need trimix. And we haven't made a video about trimix, but it puts helium in there to allow you to go deeper. We'll talk about that in another video. So if you're going to be diving very deep, I expect you're probably not watching this video because you're well beyond this level of knowledge. But if you were going to be getting a rebreather to be going very deep, you may be better suited with an eCCR than an mCCR. 95% of the people diving rebreathers are not going past 300 feet. So in that case, it's really more which one suits you more. And in a lot of cases, it has nothing, the rebreather you choose would have nothing to do with whether it's an mCCR or an eCCR. It would be the configuration of the rebreather. What are you using it for? Like, in my opinion, for side mount, the Sidewinder is the best rebreather, and it happens to be an mCCR. So there you go. That's how I chose it. If you want a back mount rebreather, there's a whole lot of options. If you want a side mount rebreather, there's a few options. They even have front mount rebreathers, believe it or not. There is also there are a couple of rebreathers that are a hybrid between this design. They use an orifice with an even smaller flow and a solenoid so that they're redundant, so that if the solenoid fails, you still have a little bit of oxygen coming through the orifice. If there was one superior design, everybody would be using it. The fact that there are actually 3 major ways that CCRs are done: manual, electronic, and hybrid manual electronic. The fact that there are 3 ways that they're done shows that there is no clearly superior way. So what you need to do when you're looking at rebreathers is you need to really look at what you're using the rebreather for. And that's where you start. And a lot of times, people don't actually pick a rebreather based on what is the best rebreather for their needs. Sometimes people pick a rebreather based on where they want to get their instruction. And so, like, you know, if your local dive shop, if they only teach 2 different kinds of rebreathers, you might, you know, 2 different brands, I mean, you might just pick one of those brands because that's the easiest way to get the training. And if you wanted to go with a different brand, maybe you'd have to fly to Florida for a week in order to get trained. And so a lot of people pick a rebreather based on their instructor, their local instructor. You know, there's a lot of different ways to pick a rebreather. My advice would be that if you're gonna pick a rebreather, do a bunch of research, talk to a bunch of people. If you ask 2 different people what the best rebreather is, guaranteed they're gonna not agree. But you need to make the decision based on what you're gonna use it for and what you think is the best rebreather for you. Because there is no best rebreather. There's different rebreathers, and there's different divers and different uses for rebreathers and different philosophies on them. The most important thing with a rebreather is once you pick the rebreather you want, get really good training from the best instructor you can find, and then practice a lot. Don't get out of practice on it. These things require your attention. They are not like regular scuba gear. You just slap it on and you go and you watch your air gauge and you're good. They have more things to worry about. And so that's really important that you stay up to date, you practice with it a lot. One last thing, sneak preview for my next video. I'm going to be talking about these little guys. I'm going to be talking about oxygen sensors. Because guess what? This whole system cannot function if you don't know what you're breathing. And you will not know what you're breathing if you don't know your PO2. And you won't know your PO2 without an oxygen sensor. This thing is what makes the whole system work. Everything else is simple. It's a bag and a canister with some chemicals in it. It's the most simple thing in the world. Did you know that the first scuba gear invented was a rebreather? It wasn't open circuit scuba. This was the first kind of scuba, somebody breathing in and out of a bag. That was the first form of scuba gear. And the oxygen sensor, that is the magic thing that makes this safe and workable. So how do those work? That's my next video. Stay tuned. Thank you for coming to see this video here in the Blue HQ. I hope you're subscribed, and if you're not, shame on you. Hit that button. And I'll see you in the next video in the Rebreather series. Thanks for coming.
Hey everyone! Thanks for watching our latest episode all the way to the end. Hit that subscribe button now so you won't miss our next episode.